Welcome back. It's my great pleasure as Provost to introduce one of our star academic leader deans. And I have two reasons for doing that. First of all, it gives me great pleasure to tell you the story about Michael. And secondly, since he's going to be asking the questions, I'm going to shamelessly suck up so that he doesn't ask me the hard ones. So here we go. Michael Meyer is the founding dean, Aga Khan University Graduate School of Media and Communications. He is an award-winning editor and correspondent for Newsweek. He came to Nairobi from the United Nations, where he served for 5 years as the communications director and chief speechwriter for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He is the author of The Alexander Complex and The Year That Changed the World, the untold story of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm told there's a picture somewhere where he's holding one of the sledgehammers. He's a member of the New York Council on Foreign Relations. And since he's been dean, there have been two events I'd like to highlight. The first is that Michael organized the project that is now known as Giving Nature a Voice, which is student-generated video pieces that are now broadcast on TV stations around the world, including Britain. And the second, and we heard the Vice Chancellor speak about Western universities' support, Michael has pulled off something that has never been done before in the history of Harvard, in that he negotiated a joint master's degree between Aga Khan University and Harvard University, and as far as we can tell,
it's working really well.
As far as we can tell, it is the first time in the history of Harvard that they have allowed their name to be used to co-brand an academic program. So that is a singular achievement there.
Thank you, Carl. That is so much more than kind. I don't know really how to respond. When Carl says that Michael did this or that, I cringe a little bit. We have an absolutely wonderful team, a brilliant team. And the reason we have such a good team is because of the Aga Khan and all his works. And Princess Zahra and her family are a magnet for global attention. Let me say one thing about this program with the Harvard Kennedy School. It's very, very interesting because we heard Stephen too talk about his hope that there would be a migration, not just an absorption of knowledge from the West, but a transmigration of knowledge and ways of doing things from the third world, if you will, the South, to the North, to the developed world, if you will. And in the case of Harvard, yes, no Harvard graduate school in the history of that university has ever partnered, co-developed a program before. Harvard chose Aga Khan University to come to Africa, but that's the least important part. Harvard University is co-developing this program for us. They don't have a communications piece in their adaptive leadership program, their single most popular executive course at Harvard. Communication is leadership, communication is everything, and this is where one area where Aga Khan University excels. And it's largely because of the power of the Aga Khan's example. So with that, Feroz, could we begin with you? We've heard a lot of talk about the liberal arts. We've heard a lot of talk about how Aga Khan University, perhaps the least known of the AKDN entities, we've heard a lot of talk about how this is going to transform and evolve, and we are. Feroz has overseen one of the most extraordinary expansions of a university that I have ever seen, and he's just getting started. This is going to be an exciting space. So Feroz, tell us what's exciting about this, and perhaps you could echo a theme that Stephen Tube presented. What do we have to offer in terms of a liberal arts education that others do not, exporting south to north?
I think the vision of the Chancellor of AKU as a liberal arts institution, as you saw from the quote, came from its founding. It was the founding vision. And people sometimes are confused because the word is called liberal arts. You've also heard the word liberal education. And it's not just about the arts. It's a multidisciplinary education that covers a broad spectrum of subjects. And the idea is that you expose a student to this spectrum of different knowledge and material, and that you could go from calculus to filmmaking to music to microbiology, and this is all in the program that the student has. But the ability to be able to deal with different material, the ability to express yourself, the ability to communicate both verbally and in writing, the ability to critically look at knowledge and try and understand it in the context of where we are. The ability to be able to question conventional wisdom, not with the intent of destroying, but with the intent of adding to it. This is all part of a liberal arts or a liberal education. And whether you study medicine or you're a teacher or you are in a professional field, this allows you to be able to then pursue a field of specialization. A liberal education, for many people, started either with the Greeks or Oxford or Cambridge offers a liberal education, but it seems to be concentrated in the northeastern part of the U.S. I have never figured out why, but that's where it seems to be concentrated, and that's where this liberal education is pursued. And as a parent, Saida and I had all three of our daughters go to a liberal arts institution because we felt we wanted them to have a broader education to be able to pursue this and then pursue a career after that. And it was very interesting that you could be trained in this broad spectrum of multiple disciplines and then be able to pursue a career in many things. So for example, some of the top investment banks, Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or others, actually recruit from liberal arts colleges. They will recruit those students because they know the one thing that they're looking for is the ongoing ability to learn new subjects, to learn as the knowledge evolves, that they can continue to do. And this is the words of the Chancellor as well. If you look at the speech, it says the ability to learn and keep on learning. Because the world is going to change. Not everything is going to remain the same. The technology is changing, the political context is changing, there are new challenges coming up. So if you have a specific subject that you learned at a specific time, are you going to be able to deal with change as it evolves and as it happens? So that for me, I think as I understand, what the Chancellor is looking for is for AKU to be able to produce its graduates who are able to deal with this through all the means that we can talk about what those are. When Carl, particularly, as a former Dean of Arts and Sciences in Toronto, but also as now a Chief Academic Officer of the university, can speak about. But this is what I take from what I think the Chancellor is looking for us to do.
Princess Zahra, you and your father are a pair of the most visionary people on this planet. We are trending from half a century of progressive political liberalism, multilateralism, a sense that we are all in this world together, from the end of World War II pretty much to recent times. This liberal consensus, the definition of a liberal education, seems to be eroding, and perhaps, Princess Zahra, you could try to come to grips with this dilemma as you talk about your experience and the vision that you and your father set for the university.
Thank you, Michael. And I think all of us here are simply trying to follow and implement parts of that vision that is my father's vision. So thank you for including us all in that. I think one of the things that he intended to do by building an education system that stretched at the time from primary to tertiary was to try to jumpstart that inquiry-based education which tended to happen in the northeast of the United States, and much less so in the countries that inherited very rigid post-colonial rote learning systems. I think that a liberal arts tradition is something that I only encountered when I was a freshman. Before that, and I think anyone who's my age or older can attest to the fact that you were taught. You didn't learn, you were simply taught. When you put that into a liberal arts context, suddenly you're pushed outside your academic boundaries. I mean, while I was studying development, I also got to study jazz. Go figure. But it was just that that context that to allow students to access the broadest possible number of topics to allow you or any student to learn. So it's about digesting the information. It's about acquiring the skills to review something critically, to approach a problem in a creative way and not just be focused on one solution, to be able to access multiple solutions of your own volition because you've been taught to not just apply one rigorous doctrine of learning, but rather a diverse approach to huge volumes of information or very complex problems. And I think that's where getting to a liberal arts institution, taking AKU to a liberal arts institution, a liberal arts university, will drive the rest of the education system in the same direction. So it will percolate not just across universities, but also through the school system.
And can we take that, perhaps levitate that a few more feet to the ether sphere? We heard Stephen Toobh talk about universities as forces for change. Change the world was the phrase he used, a cliche, but in our case of Aga Khan University, AKDN, we do change the world, and we do it daily. I think the people in this room underestimate often the role that they, individually, and we, collectively, play in the world. And it's one of the reasons why so many of us in this room who could excel in any career, from making bazillions in banking to being prominent journalists, have come here as opposed to doing other things. In addition to this agent of change idea, the university as bridges of unison, this is something your father speaks of in different language. Can you address this just very briefly as well, in the context of how we're evolving as a liberal arts education university?
Do you mean in terms of the geographic breadth and the long-term
Well, there are some very
development?
challenging environments where a liberal arts education will seem alien.
Indeed, this is true. It's also true in the context of the other universities, University of Central Asia, for example. Each one has inherited an academic environment which is very specific. And there is a pushback against liberal arts education because it's seen as something associated with a certain demographic. But I think that the intellectual development of liberal arts will depend very much on the initial success. And when you look at the phenomenal past of AKU that went stratospheric basically from the very beginning in terms of medicine, nursing, teaching, impacting the lives of women, because those are very often less medicine nowadays, yes, but impacting the role in the lives of women from the start onwards. I think we're aiming to do the same with liberal arts, i.e. not start at a level where you're just sort of creating a program and having a bit of an impact, but it'll take hundreds of years to prove your model. I think on the contrary, we're aiming to start at a level where, even if there is pushback, the proof of concept is such and is so rapid that a liberal arts education will be seen as something of value, whichever context we start it in.
And that will take time. And as everyone knows, among all these institutions in the world, we are one of the few who play a genuinely long game, if I think that's fair to say. Carl, can we ask you a little bit about how this would look a bit more granularly? What would a liberal arts program look like? But before you go in here, I'd like to roll out a little bit of of biography that might not be in your programs. Carl is a very interesting man. He's a person of extraordinary breadth. He grew up in the coal fields of Pennsylvania, one of 10 children, probably not the wealthiest suburb of Philadelphia. And here is Carl sitting on this stage before a global audience. Carl is also a geographer of considerable accomplishment. Now, I don't know how Carl's interest in the world and its full breadth and intensity and diversity sprang from growing up in rural coal country Pennsylvania, but it did. And he not only became a very prominent scholar, he also became a very prominent doer because he became deputy minister, another minister, of health for Alberta. And I believe you controlled some humongous percentage of Canada's health budget, Carl. This is a man of dimension. This is a man who's taken learning and applied it in very practical ways. This is a no-nonsense man who dreams of traveling the world and who in Pennsylvania dreamed of having a job like this his entire life, working for the Aga Khan. In his small way, he is a model of why we are all here and what we are doing here. So Carl, take that softball away and hit it.
It pays to give a good introduction. It's a question that's come up at several points along my various institutional careers. What is this liberal arts and science thing? And the word liberal has been a very, very complicated piece of liberal arts and science. It's almost as if it was designed to complicate 300 years of higher education evolution. Little bit of history. If there's any real card-carrying historians in the audience, you can criticize me later or write it down. But the liberal arts and science was a response in the 19th century to a higher education system that was designed to do two things, especially in Europe. It was designed to maintain the control of the Catholic Church, and it was designed to maintain the control of the monarchs who claimed their right to rule came right from divine intervention. And the curriculum of the early colleges of Oxford and Cambridge were inevitably church-based and protected by a monarch. So the reason he's a vice-chancellor is the chancellors were usually members of the royal family, the aristocrats. And if you go to Oxford, Cambridge colleges, you can see the list of chancellors in the early years for a very long time were all dukes, once in a while a duchess, princes. So that was the higher education system. And then we had the international economy, we had traders, we had the mercantilist. So society, the leaders of civil society, started asking the question, how do we run society? How do we get out of the agrarian, church-based system? So there were two major thinkers. One, a pair of brothers in Germany, the Humboldts, who proposed a model that is research evidence-based. The job of the university is to advance knowledge. The countervailing view, oddly enough, a cardinal in England, John Cardinal Newman, who switched sides halfway through his career from Anglican to Catholic, but he kept the cardinal part. His view was the job of higher education is to train the leaders of tomorrow. It's right there if you read his early works. He sort of slipped a bit. He said, and these are the children of the aristocrats, so he didn't get it quite right. So our university and Western universities merged the two. So you have colleges, Harvard College, embedded in this big research edifice, Harvard University. If you go to the big Canadian universities, they have a whole bunch of little colleges embedded in a big research edifice. We started sort of upside down. We started with our professional research-intensive faculties, and now we will insert that liberal arts and science college. So when the chancellor says it will complete us, it's exactly that model of taking Humboldt and Newman, civil society, leaders of tomorrow, and all of that which you get out of a big, powerful research university. So for me, the characteristic of a liberal arts and science education, it's liberal in the context of its history, in that it is a higher education model embedded in broad access for society, regardless of means, regardless of history, regardless of your station in society. So when you see 80% of our nurses in Karachi coming from northern Pakistan, regardless of station in society, regardless of economic means, regardless of family potential, come to us. So for me, if you go back to the documents that founded us, the Derek Bott Harvard Commission and the Chancellor's Commission, it was just so simple. After struggling to find purpose in the sprawling Canadian higher education system, to begin to see the clarity, the precision that the Chancellor has brought to the mission of AKU from before it was founded. Derek Bott is one of the icons of 20th century higher education. You don't get to be in my job without reading his books, and he's an academic, so they're whopping big, thick books. Like, it's not a quick read. But you map all of that to the vision of the Chancellor that you heard about this morning, and I think we are the living embodiment of that model of broad-based higher education to create civil society in a pluralistic context. That's the short version.
We'll get to the long version shortly.
No, you got to pay tuition for the long version.
Now, Carl, I'd like very briefly to ask a little bit of follow-up, and Princess Zahra and Feroz, if you would like to chime in very briefly, because I would like to get to Naguib here. I teach in Kenya, and even in the United States, where young journalists that I trained came out of a liberal arts education, the art of critical thinking, the art of challenging authority, just the sheer brass that it takes to raise a question that may cause a professor to look askance at you. This takes a certain training, a certain cultural tradition. How do you move, Carl and others, from a more rote learning that we see in Kenya, say, or increasingly in the United States where people are studying to exams, or China, to the kind of critical thinking that is the essence of leadership that we strive for? How do we do that in a practical way? Very briefly.
I think the way we hire our academic colleagues, what we look for, how we assess, how we reward, how we promote our academic colleagues. If we look only at computer automated exam outcomes, then we will propagate the species. If we give our academic colleagues the time and the class size and the resources to do a much more intensive mentoring, a sort of British tutorial style of higher education, then we will produce that generation of critical thinking. And when I was in my old job, several jobs ago, and I would interview the employers of the students who graduated from arts and science, these were big banks, big industry. I asked them, why do you hire arts and science? Because their payroll departments wanted to hire MBAs. And this is not to criticize anyone who holds an MBA, but the CEOs were looking for people who could think, who could speak, who could analyze data, who could construct an argument. And towards the end of my run in Toronto, they started saying, and who could speak in more than one language. So there it is.
And Princess Zahra, did you ever have a breakthrough moment where you discovered your own power as an individual and perhaps free thinker at Harvard and challenged orthodoxy?
I do remember sitting as a freshman, sitting in a History of Africa course where the professor was expounding the benefits of African socialism. And I thought, hang on a sec, I just came back from Tanzania. Didn't look like a very good model to me. But couldn't say that because I'm an 18-year-old student and what the hell are you doing going to Tanzania? But no, to get back to I think your topic, I think that you're actually touching on the chicken and egg nature of civil society. Because where we don't have a free media, where there isn't a fair judicial system, where there isn't structures of the administration and the nation that work, it's very often because there aren't enough qualified people to build those structures or to man those structures. And therefore, those difficult questions don't get asked because there is no fair and free forum to do so. So without training people in liberal arts and training people to ask those questions in an informed enough way that it is not a challenge, it's simply a set of questions. Without having those people present on the national stage, you don't build civil society. But without civil society, you can't train those people. So in this particular context, I think when you're talking about forming people who have the intellectual ability to challenge the status quo, it's something that you have to do with great intellectual capacity. And I think that's what Carl was saying. It will depend on the quality of the faculty and the training.
Excellent.
If I could just add a very short response. In addition to this openness that Princess Zahra and Carl talked about, for the faculty or the professor to accept this challenge, and I think it's understood also, it's a challenge, the culture, you talked about it in the context, the challenge is with a view to add rather than to destroy. And that's somehow lost today in the world, because challenges are seen as an attempt to destroy or demean or put down. The other point I just want to make, going back to Carl, I think the history lesson that Carl provided was very useful on the Western liberal education model. But as you heard in the quote, liberal education without this definition was part of Al-Azhar University 1,000 years ago. Yeah. It was an invitation to scholars to come and learn from knowledge from far away, and then continue to add to that knowledge and invite people from other cultures and other religions and so on. So this openness to absorbing and learning and adding was part of the Islamic intellectual tradition from almost the very beginning. I'm not a historian of that. There are many experts in the room who can explain this much better than I can. But I think this is what the Chancellor said, that this has been part of the history of intellectual inquiry and expression and knowledge, and using that knowledge to solve problems that society faces, which are all part of today's liberal arts education. But there is, and we need to understand, just as Carl was able to articulate the historic connection of liberal arts education to Europe, part of our work, I hope the scholars that are here, can help connect it back to the origins of the Islamic intellectual tradition.
Naguib, you are a magician. This is a man who, if he stayed in banking, and his resume is a galaxy of big names in Wall Street and finance, he would be running Goldman Sachs. Like others, he has chosen to be here with us, and I think that says a great deal about both the man and the power of this institution. Now, among the many acts of magic that you will be called upon to perform is translating this dream into reality. We've heard from the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge. I don't know what Cambridge's endowment is, but I think it says something like £5 billion right here. 31 colleges I don't know where in the world or in the United States, have endowments totaling almost $7 billion. Harvard's is $37 billion. Why do they charge tuition? I don't know. But, the reality is that we are going to try to create an elite, an intellectual and professional elite of future leaders out of students who come from often rather impoverished and certainly not elite backgrounds. We have to pay for this. We don't have an endowment. What sort of magic are we going to work to make all this possible over the next 35 years of our institutional life?
Thank you, Michael. Well, I'm not sure I believe in magic, but there are steps we can take to make this work. But I think it's worth just taking a step backwards and thinking about the university funding model, because really no universities are able to function from fee revenue and cover their costs. So how do universities fund themselves? Yes, they get fees. A lot of universities get money from governments. Universities have big endowments, as you are referring to, and they get income from their endowment. And they get annual giving from their alumni and their other supporters. So if you look at it in our context, we operate in mostly in developing country contexts where we're trying to provide a world-class quality of education, but we can't charge the fees that correlate with that world-class education to start with. And we have a principle of universal access irrespective of the ability to pay, so we have a double barrier to earning a lot of money out of fees. We're a private university, so we don't take money from the government to subsidize our programs. And we're a very young university, so most universities built up their endowment over many, many years. We've only been going a very short period of time, so we don't have big endowment, and we don't have a big alumni base. So most of the endowments that have been built by universities come from alumni giving money to their alma mater, and it takes time to have alumni who've made enough money who can give it to the university to enable it to build its endowment, and even alumni who get to the point in their income cycle where they have surplus income to give annual giving. And we're beginning to see that after 35 years of operation, we have people who graduated, particularly from the medical college, who are very generously giving now to the university to acknowledge what the university did for them. So when you look at our model, we're very challenged. So we can't charge high fees. We don't take money from the governments. We don't have a long history of alumni who can support giving and the endowment. So how have we managed to do what we've been doing to date? Well, Firoz put the slide up. The chancellors contributed a huge amount of money to get this university off the ground. And this group of people and others in the Ismaili community have been tremendous supporters. So if you ask Richard, our Chief Development Officer, how do you get somebody motivated to give who has no connection to the university? A lot of the people who've given from our community have given because it's a project that Hazrat Imam wanted to push forward, and they followed his lead and said, we will support what you want to achieve. That's a pretty unique situation. I don't think any other organization would have been able to mobilize support from a standing start like that. The other thing that AKU has done, which doesn't really come out and wasn't in Firoz's presentation, AKU was very early in figuring out how it could develop income-producing activities that built on its strengths as a medical college and teaching hospital. So it developed a whole series of businesses in healthcare that produce today over $40 million a year of profit. And that $40 million of profit from the labs and the private clinics and the other things that we run goes to subsidize the medical education program. So we don't have a big endowment, but we have a business. If we had to have a business, if we had an endowment that was generating $40 million a year, we'd need 800 million of endowment to do that. Instead, we have a business that's been started from scratch and built up to be able to do that. But even in the medical side, where there is more prospect of people developing relatively high-paid jobs and getting jobs immediately out of university, we're challenged in that model in terms of being able to keep up with the investment required in the health system and produce the education at the level we want to run the education program. So that model is really creaking and straining and under real pressure today. And without developing the new graduate schools and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, we have to do something to take some pressure off that medical education system to be funded only from the hospitals and the clinics. And in some of the places we operate, we probably can't do that much more to grow those businesses because we're already pretty big in those countries. So we have to do more to develop the endowment and the giving program, and we can't rely on the Ismaili community to do all of that. So we have to get much better at going outside the community and developing an endowment so that the medical program, which is at the core of AKU, is able to be kept at the kind of standard that we want to operate in. Now, when you move to the graduate schools and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the problem becomes much more acute because you can charge even less fees than you can in medical school. Medical school fees globally are amongst the highest of any discipline. You can't charge in an undergraduate liberal arts those kinds of fees because people can't afford to pay them. So our problem becomes all the more acute, and I think the solution lies in multiple strands. One strand is to not be wedded to starting too big in anything. So you've started a media school. We didn't build a building. We did it in a rented premises. We started with a few faculty, a few students. We're gradually developing it. So starting small and then scaling up as and when we can afford to do it is definitely one route. And we've learned a lot about that in the University of Central Asia, where we had a very big vision for the liberal arts education program, and we shrunk to do it in a much smaller scale, to do it at the level we could afford to start at. So starting small is one. The second is having partners. We don't need to do this all ourselves. So we heard from the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge about how interested they are in learning from us and working from us. We heard about the partnership with Harvard. We have many friends out there and many places we can go to get help. So we don't need to do it all ourselves. And I think the third thing is to get much more serious about raising the kind of money that will be required to support these endeavors. So I think that the practice of launching at a scale where we can afford the launch, but we can't afford the aftermath of the launch, is a very dangerous way of working. And I think one of the disciplines that the Board of Trustees has tried to bring to the university is to temper ambition to be responsible with what we can actually support going forward, because there's no point starting something that you can't maintain after you've started it. So we are scaling up the fundraising capacity at the university, and what we really need to do is to go outside the community. We need to get to the next generation in the community. We have a lot of people who are very, very well connected in our community, and we, instead of just looking to the community to provide funding, we've got to look to the community to make connections and introductions and help us get this funding from elsewhere. And I think if we do this in a very high quality way and our programs are recognized for excellence, even if they're small, they'll attract support. And I think it's much easier to get people to support something that's up and running at a small scale than to buy into a big vision that they can't see beyond some charts and pictures.
Very well said, very comprehensive. Thank you. A large challenge, but as you can see, we are in good hands. And now it is your turn. And a brief glance at the questions. I did ask softballs. Sorry, these are not. So, Princess Zahra and Feroz, you're on the spot once again. In some parts of the world, education systems are not supportive of the core values of a liberal arts education. Many of those countries are places we operate. In fact, there are core places where we operate. Do we have a strategy for moving in and changing attitudes?
Princess Zahra touched on this earlier. I think it starts at 3 levels. One is we have to start this understanding of liberal education at the school level. Can't wait until the student gets to the university. The IB curriculum that AKES and the academies have begun is it's basically a liberal arts curriculum. The examination board the AKU examination board in Pakistan focuses on that at grade 6. We start with the kids with this middle school program to get them to understand. And I'll give you an example of how that happens. They're learning mathematics. So the teacher today comes, there's a book, a textbook, and they're prescribed, they need to know this problem, this problem, this problem, and they have to go through 3 pages. The exam board curriculum says, we're going to take you to the stock exchange. You're going to see how a stock exchange works. And they learn about decimals and fractions and percentages, and they learn the same material, but they also learned about something else. They learned about how the economy works. They learned about budgets. They learned about currencies. They learned about other things. That's the difference between a rote learning curriculum and one that we are working on. So that's the second point. The third, and I think this is the most difficult part, is we have to get the parents to understand the difference. Because parents make the choice. They decide whether the student goes to this school or that school, whether it's this curriculum or that curriculum, or this exam system or that exam. And that's which is much more difficult, and that's where we need to start to work and address this problem to the parents, then also to the school system in the curricula that we're looking at, and then also how a student's educational outcomes are measured, which allows them then to go forward into to university.
Carl, or Princess Zahra, do you have a second beat?
2 little points. One is that Hasri told us about 10 years ago to massively increase the provision or access to early childhood development. And we're doing that with AKU through the Human Development Program. AKF does a lot of early childhood development. But recently, in the last 2-3 years, his focus has been on pluralism in ECD, which to me is a very interesting notion that you would take a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and make pluralism the focus of those years of education. But I think that speaks to your question. And in terms of changing systems that aren't necessarily open to a liberal arts approach, when I think back to 25 years ago, it's a lot better today than it was then. The concept of a national curriculum has evolved, albeit slowly depending on the countries. But I think also it's very important that, and I speak as AKES now, but I think it's very important to aim for an IB, aim for a international curriculum, whether it's A-levels or the rest, but also improve, add on to, enrich the national curriculum and continue to teach national curriculum. Because that's how those nations can trial different things that are possibly closer to liberal arts without threatening the system as a whole.
Carl, this is a question asked almost collectively from the audience, not necessarily requiring a collective answer from us. What can we do to help AKU become a premier liberal arts university? What is your ask?
I think there's many things, and I'll go by way of example. As I've started traveling around to meet groups of our alumni in and around Baltimore, especially at Johns Hopkins University, we have over 30 graduates who are now in very senior positions within government and industry, Hopkins University, the Baltimore health scene. So I met with them a few months ago, and it was a very important event for me. We got together, we were hosted, we got together at one of our alumni houses, and we had the usual preamble conversation. But then after dinner, we started into a very much more complicated discussion, the end of which my sense is, fine, you can keep asking us for money and we will keep giving you money, but we have the potential through everything we do to be extraordinarily helpful in connecting our institution to other institutions. So I think the foundation of a liberal arts and science core at Aga Khan University is going to require us to very much more on purpose bring academic talent from all of our partners, from all of our alumni, to bear inside the university. We will always be a small university compared to the landscape, compared to our partners. We will succeed by expanding our reach into the intellectual communities that are affiliated friendly to us. And I think that's one of the strategies. If we don't have the endowment to hire everybody, and even if we did, we probably couldn't convince very many of them to give up their current positions, but we can reach out and convince them to work with us, to come to receive our students, to mentor our academic staff, and to build that multiplier effect that is, in a financial context, not on our budget, it's on somebody else's budget. So that's one of the strategies we're pursuing.
Naguib, how will people who get a liberal arts education survive financially?
Well, I think we heard the answer to that earlier. I mean, liberal arts graduates are recruited into all kinds of different professions. Doesn't stop them going on to do things in master's level education. Lots of liberal arts graduates go and do law degrees and become very successful lawyers. So I think it's not a barrier to lots of lucrative professions. And I think we have to go back to one of the things that Stephen Toop talked about. You know, we can't measure success in jobs and income alone. So a certain proportion of the people that come through our liberal arts program are going to go and be in theatre or work in NGOs or do all kinds of other things that are good in society that don't result in lots of income. And that's what we should encourage.
I don't have a particular person in mind to answer this one, but how will the liberal arts curriculum that AKU offers be contextual? And are we partnering with other developing world institutions?
We haven't said too much about AKDN, but I think we have to recognize that AKU, as part of AKDN, can provide our students and our graduates access to a sort of integrated, multifaceted life course that is simply not available anyplace else that I've been. We can provide learning opportunities. We can bring AKDN people into our classrooms. We can work out very, very interesting partnerships. And the context then can be provided by the field work, the internships, the co-op learning opportunities. So I'd say the easy, obvious answer, without getting into any kind of institutional complexity, is to fully exploit all that AKDN offers to us.
I think also, if I could just quickly add, the curriculum that Carl's talking about as we work on the strength of the AKDN, you talked about other partnerships, and I mean, Alex Awiti is sitting there, Joe Lugal is there, and some of us are educated in East Africa. The textbooks that I learned from in East Africa started with the colonial period. But there was history before that. That isn't captured, right? And we as a university can, as a liberal arts institution, if nothing else, can look at the history that's already now being written by people who are trying to get to the records and so on. I mean, yesterday we talked about an example. Stefan Pradin, one of our speakers, talked about the excavation he's doing in East Africa, which is uncovering the presence of the Chinese, right, in the 10th century, which is uncovering some very interesting unknown to date facts. Our role as a liberal arts institution would be to support that, to research that, to publish that, and hopefully be able to be teaching those things in the school. That's also a role of a liberal arts institution.
It's an exciting prospect, and in a moment I'm going to ask our panelists, fair warning all, a question. What is your big idea for AKU as we enter the next chapter of our existence, the next 35 years? And while you're thinking on that, let me read a last question that is more a statement from you, the audience, on the transformative power of generosity. The small token of generosity by the donors here in this room is by no means comparable to the generosity of the Aga Khan and his family.
I would have clapped for my dad, I can't clap for you.
Princess Zahra, rest assured that I can tell by the handwriting that this is not a planted question. And it's not done. We thank you for giving so much of their time, effort, and care to AKU, and in fact to the whole world. We would like to do more. Tell us how to do it. Richard, this is probably your cue. We will be getting back to you. And now on to the final question from our panelists in no particular order except your eagerness to answer. What is the next big idea for our next 35 years?
Well, I'm happy to start with that. I mean, you were asking about the magic and how we're going to do it. One of the things we haven't talked about is technology. And so how can we embrace today's and tomorrow's technology to facilitate the development of these next streams of the university in a way where we can reach more people more effectively without having to do it all in bricks and mortar?
Princess Zahra, you're next.
I think I would say, first of all, thank you all very much. Thank you. And I will pass that message to, as we call him, the Chancellor. But I think interdisciplinary study. So when I was in school, you learnt history or you learnt mathematics. And today, the sciences, the arts, big thinking, metadata, all of that is interdisciplinary study. The academic silos are breaking down. And I think that AKU will benefit from knowledge and knowledge in those areas as they are today, but also moving in that direction tomorrow. How does a biologist work with an economist? Because the world of the future will require that kind of understanding.
Carl, you have the penultimate word.
Every time I get a hard question, I go back to the Chancellor's 4 pieces of advice: impact, quality, relevance, and access. And you add those up, IQRA. That's a very powerful statement in the context of all that the Chancellor teaches us and all that you know so well. The second piece then is, what can we offer to the world that in all of my travels I have seen nobody else able to offer, and that's access to 6 countries. 5 of them very well organized, this one not so sure, so let's stick to the 5. We have an ability to aggregate data, and there's big, powerful captains of industry who have said, the only thing of value I have is my data. I think that was one of the big IT gurus. We have data. We have data that we don't always appreciate is rare, and it is unbelievably valuable. We have 3,000 patients of our own with AKDN. We have 5,000 patients and many more than 6 countries.
5.5 million.
Million. What did I say?
5.5 million.
You are a few zeros
Million,
out.
million. Yeah. So we can do socioeconomic data. We have the kind of data that Alex Oidi can produce through his surveys. We have access to all of the government statistical data. We alone can create a multi-country integrated data system that looks at health outcomes, social determinants, economics, income, and we can do this, and we can get it organized, and we will have the world lining up to help us understand our data. And I've already asked Al Karim to get the pricing access model developed before we need it. So I think the big idea for us is to understand that as we sit in a multinational setting, a lower middle income multinational setting, which will soon have a very, very high proportion of the world's population, and will have an enormously high proportion of young people, it's sitting here. We don't have to buy it. We already own it. We already generate it. It sounds very mechanistic, but if we could get our hands around the value of our data and integrate it into everything we do, first of all, I think we would make the Finance Committee lose less sleep, and I think we would position ourselves as transforming higher education in the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, the future is ours. Feroz, can we close with you?
I think there are some really powerful comments. I want to piggyback on what Princess Zahra said. The interdisciplinary part is really important, but I think it has to be embedded around something. And I think that is, the idea is stem cells in regenerative medicine. I think that's the next big thing that the university could focus on, but not because it's a medical or health sciences. Obviously, that's a big part of it. It's going to affect the way we teach science, the way we treat patients in a hospital, outside. And since a lot of our income, a lot of our knowledge is based in health sciences, that is the next generation. That's the next phase. And we cannot afford not to be in it, because it is where medicine is going, healthcare is going. But it also has the multidisciplinary dimensions. You need to understand the economics of treatment that come out of it. We need to understand the ethical issues. So when we talk about a liberal education, the whole area of philosophy and ethics is a big part of it. We need to understand the actual treatment of it, and that engineering will be part of the solution of how you're going to deliver some of these treatments and what the substrates are going to look like in some of the treatments and so on. And much is unknown. And the fact that we are dealing with the unknown is where I think a liberal education is very powerful, because as things evolve, we need to adapt and add. And that's where, so I think for the next big thing, I think using that as a platform to build off, I think, and using the data capability and the other aspects of it, I think could be a powerful way for us to go forward.
Thank you, Feroz. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I think your attention has been intense and obvious, and your questions good. And perhaps you could join me in thanking our panelists. This was quite an extraordinary